narratives tour here at the Amsterdam Museum. I'm really honored to have been invited to give a tour here at the exhibition Colonial Stories. I'm here with you to share a little bit about my stories and let's say my perspective also on what is a museum. So the question of where are we, what are we doing here? I think for me starts with what is a museum, in particular what's a museum in Amsterdam. And yeah, I studied anthropology and as well as heritage and memory studies. And then at a certain point I left the university because I'd been active next to my studies to answer some of these questions in Amsterdam of how do we deal with colonial legacies, how can we do this in a collective way, but then also how do we deal with a lot of the very real divisions that exist between people because of, well, colonial history and the power relations that come with that. The reason why I want to make a first stop here in, well, it is the first room also of the exhibition, but next to that what I find interesting as well as significant is the positioning of the museum in relation to specific people, let's say, that work within this environment. I mean, if you talk about, okay, what is a museum? There's a lot of people behind the museum doing a lot of work. I think that there's some tension between this question of, individual responsibility, what is your power, what is your role as an individual, versus what actually is, what are the collective works, what are the collective efforts we need to make long-term to actually create the kind of changes which I'll be discussing with you today, what kind of changes I, for example, would find important to see in relation to the museum. It's really great to see people from different generations, people from different positions, some more activist, some coming from the university or within the museum, all talking about why, what kind of power institutions have to shape basically what kind of knowledge is considered important, who you listen to, or I'm talking here about we, this is also a complicated question, but who do we learn to listen to when it comes to who has knowledge, who has authority to speak, whose perspective is interesting. And, well, one of the things, as much as I love seeing, I'd say, the representation of different generations, different positions working on this question, I do wonder, and this is something I think in the long term that really needs to be critically looked at, is this idea of an expert in the context of the museum world. So we have here 5 experts. Why do people need to be seen as, or considered experts from, let's say, the museum's perspective or the institution's perspective before they get included? Who decides when someone is an expert on a particular subject? And I think that this is also part of the colonial legacy of museums. We have Karan Fatah Black over here, historian. And he mentions that decolonization is a term that's used very loosely and very lightly, at least in his experience. And I can definitely understand what he means, because if I refer back to this collective that I was a part of with Tijdens here, part of the student occupation of administration building of the University of Amsterdam here in 2015, that the slogan of University of Color was no democratization without decolonization. And we need to decolonize the university. But then as we received a lot of resistance and we understood just how entrenched the colonialism was in the institution, just how much it was part of the foundations, we also started to question, are these foundations that can be changed? And why is it that we continue to look towards these particular institutions as the place where knowledge is to be made, where experts are made also? What kind of experts, what kind of knowledge? This self-reflection is often missing. And I think it's very important also to realize that the impact of this kind of knowledge, we're not talking just theory here. What we're talking about is that the Netherlands at this very moment is still a colonial kingdom. There's, if you look towards the Caribbean, for example, that the Netherlands still has colonies. And independence struggles, decolonization, is not a bloodless affair. So I also want to, let's say, guide you through this exhibition, from my perspective, always keeping in mind that what we're doing here is fundamentally not about the fate of the museum, but it's about the fate of, I think, collectively, the trajectory of our world, the role that museums play in this, and that it's important collectively also to try to keep our eye on freedom, liberation, and to honor also all of the sacrifices, very serious sacrifices that have been made and that continue to be made, by our ancestors, people fighting alongside us now, that I hope I can be fighting alongside. I hope that I can honor them in this way. To always have this in the back of our mind. Another reason why it was important for me to stand still here in this first room is also to recognize how it is that I came to be here in this room talking with you now. Is that I was invited by Ines van der Scheer, who is a junior curator at the Amsterdam Museum and also has curated this exhibition, and that we have a history which involves also student occupation back in 2015 of an administrative building of the University of Amsterdam with a collective called University of Color, and I have my badge here, which I'm always very happy to be able to wear and to be able to share a little bit about the meaning of this collective for me. It's very important for me also to recognize what are the connections between this collective that I am a part of, University of Color, and the different kinds of activism that is made visible in this exhibition. So, for example, here behind me, we have some images of the Black Lives Matter protests that took place in recent years, globally, specifically also in Amsterdam. This question, I think, also of working within institutions as individuals or working collectively. I think one of the most important lessons that I learned being a part of this collective, University of Color, together with some colleagues that feature in the exhibition, as well as Ines, is that collective action is extremely important, that the kind of power that colonialism has to coerce people, to seduce people, to entice people, also forcefully, very violently oppress, that this is a kind of power that cannot be broken by individuals. It absolutely must be collective. I'm standing here now by myself, but I hope that I can carry the energy of the collective of University of Color with me. I try to do this wherever I go when I speak about University of Color. Whenever we would go to a meeting, we would go all together. We would make sure that, tactics of divide and conquer, that we could subvert those, that we could say, hey, we see that you're trying to offer some crumbs to one of us, but we're not going to accept that because all of us are here and we all matter and we all care about each other. And we also care about people that are not in this room. And I think that this is also something which this exhibition attempts to do, is to make visible also some of, let's say, traces that are left by the white gaze, the cis gaze, the cisgender gaze, the heterosexual gaze, I could go on there. I think also class is very important to mention there. That this gaze really erases a lot of voices in an institutional setting. But I think that there's also a very interesting dynamic there also with sometimes people don't want to be visible, or they don't want their work to be visible. And I think sometimes there's also very good reasons for that. And these are all, I think, great lessons to learn collectively, so I hope to be able to take you with me and that we can learn a little bit more about this from each other as well. The reason that I'm standing between, say, this infographic here, or a collection of infographics titled Facts, Numbers, and Questions, and then here on the other side we have an image of Paulus Godin, who was a mayor of Amsterdam, as well as an active participant in the Dutch slave trade, and currently his residence is still being used by Amsterdam mayors as their official residence. The reason why I'm standing in between these two is because I find it very interesting to think about the ways that museums, basically how they developed, as well as how they maintain their position in society. I think that if we're talking about power, I don't think it's the case that a person or an institution, that they simply are powerful. I think this is something that a lot of effort is put into to reach this kind of position, and a lot of effort and work is put into maintaining being in this position, right? So, how does this happen in the context of an exhibition, for example? Well, I think one way is by positioning a museum, positioning itself as a place where you can go and you can find out what are the facts. What is the truth? What is, let's say, the objective knowledge? I think one way to go about this is to provide, for example, numbers. I don't think numbers really land with everyone, but with certain people they definitely do. What I find interesting here about in this exhibition, that this use of, let's say, the infographics and the numbers, is to look back at the collection and to offer, let's say, the visitor a kind of insight into what actually happens behind the scenes at the museum. That the objects that are a part of a museum, that they're part of a larger archive, and that there are efforts also to research how these collections came together. Now, what I find interesting is, in terms of determining what are the facts, what are the numbers that matter, what are the questions that matter, it's about who's asking these questions. Why are these questions being asked? Why are they considered important? And how can a museum give context to the fact that actually there is no objective position? That they can't give one objective view of reality and that the visitor should take this as simply the truth. I think this exhibition tries to trouble this, but I wanted to offer at this point also a little bit of my story, which I think, it's not directly correlated to this previous mayor of Amsterdam, but I do think it's important also to recognize that the power that these kind of numbers have, that these kind of representations of data have, are also linked to, let's say, power relations that also happen behind the scenes at a museum. Now, you can talk about a museum, you can also talk about a university. In my case, I'm more familiar with the environment of the university. And what I experienced myself is that actually a lot of determining what are the questions, what are the numbers that matter, etc., that this goes along with actually often a lot of bullying, people denigrating each other, because I think that there's a lot of pressure within these kinds of institutions, for example, to be making a career, to really position yourself as some kind of authority, to fight for your turf in, let's say, the framework that you're given within the museum or the university. And I think that the fight is trying to see beyond these kind of, let's say, interpersonal dynamics and seeing actually why is this structure making all of these people so that they're in such an antagonistic relation with each other. There's something there, which I think when you're looking at an exhibition, sometimes you see little traces here and there, but I think for me, this is an important, let's say, spot where I feel I can offer what I've experienced and what I've seen behind the scenes at the university, for example, to show people that, hey, when you're walking around through an exhibition, what you're seeing is the result of a long process of negotiations, a long process of, it's not easy, I think, to come together and to decide what are the important questions here. And I think that at the moment, as things stand, that power is still very often skewed towards people that have, let's say, the colonial backing of whether it's material resources to, let's say, socialization. Do you know how to move through a museum? Do you know how to interact with people in a professional way? What does that mean? What does that look like? So this is, I think, part of the conversation that I would like to have with people when walking through an exhibition. And I think that, yeah, a portrait like this, it also, I think, puts a face to that there are people in power in these institutions. In this case, this mayor who signed a contract to sell 4,000 enslaved people from Curaçao to the Spanish colonies. That I think also a lot of the negotiations, they happen on paper. Things like signing contracts. They happen in small letters of documents that are often not accessible to people from the public. So this is another area where I think it's very interesting, let's say, to make this connection between, you see data, and then you see the face of someone in power. What actually is happening there? That at the end of the day, the visitor comes, sees the data, and is often seduced to having the impression that this is objective knowledge, that we, who is we, that there's some kind of collective we that all agrees that these are the facts and this is reality. Yeah, this is a tapestry which speaks to me, I think also because of my personal background. So in the previous room of this exhibition, the theme is that's making visible the invisible in the collection, so that there's a lot of objects in the archive which as I understood the exhibition, it's not considered a typical colonial collection. Well, we can question what it means to be typical or untypical, but I think that this tapestry for me represents some visibilities and invisibilities that relate also to my personal background, specifically also because of the room that we're in. So the room that we're in now is entitled Amsterdam and Independent Indonesia. And I grew up actually as the son of someone that worked in the development world. So I worked for the UN, for example. So because of that, I lived in different countries and I went to international schools. This means that in a lot of these countries, or all of these countries, mostly in Asia and Africa, that I lived, let's say, in an elite bubble. I was going to school with, let's say, international expats, as well as, let's say, people from the local elite. And in this room, there are different treasures, let's say, that were received by Dutch diplomats in exchanges between different heads of state or different people of different positions within governments. And that, let's say, at this level of politics, the exchanging of gifts, the exchanging of objects, I think is a very symbolic action. And I find it also very interesting to see that a large part of the collection that the Amsterdam Museum has access to be able to exhibit here, was given, for example, by statesmen from Indonesia, for example, Suharto, General Suharto, and that there's kind of a very, let's say, violent colonial context, and then at the same time this exchange of tapestries, exchange of silverware, exchange of gifts, and I think it's very interesting for us to think about the fact that these are donated and then, or let's say they're exchanged between diplomats, and then they're not actually the ownership of the individual that is in the position of being a diplomat, but that the object is in the ownership of, let's say, the institution, the state, the government. And that it's only through this collection owned by the government that the Amsterdam Museum, for example, is able to make concrete links with the history to Indonesia. I find it very interesting, if we're talking about what's visible, what's invisible, that somehow in the Amsterdam Museum collection, that it is so difficult to find traces of this very important colonial history that the Netherlands has with Indonesia. Another thing I find very interesting is also, if we're talking about this tapestry as well as others, like some of the technologies that are used some of the ways of making art, ways of making meaning that are used to make a gift to another government, is that here we have, for example, some like an example of batik. And one of the most interesting things I find about batik is not necessarily related to that it's being exchanged between diplomats, but how they acquire a different meaning. That, for example, a tapestry like this, that it's presented to represent the nation Indonesia, but really it's not. It's represented as, let's say, an authentic representation. This is something that's from Indonesia. This is what is made in Indonesia. This is an example, when really this tapestry was made very specifically to appeal to what the Dutch would find interesting about Indonesia. And so at this level, I find it very interesting also to reflect on that. Well, this has not to do just with exchanging gifts. It also has to do with industries, mass production. So this is an example that's very, very beautiful. But what's behind it is also the fact that these, let's say, violent colonial relations, that they also shaped the way that batik was made in Indonesia. And from what I understand, that in the inland, that there's a, and that continues to be made, batik, which is made by people that have, let's say, authority in a local context to be making this kind of work. And then on the coast, that actually because of Dutch and English colonialism, that there was developed an industry of mass production of batik. And that this then turned into an industry in the Netherlands, this production moved to the Netherlands, and then from there, because there wasn't really a local interest in the Netherlands for these goods, that in the end, actually, they moved where they wanted to sell these products. They looked towards Africa as the main market to be selling these products. And at that point, you know, you can ask whether you can call it batik or not. I think now it's generally known under the name of wax prints, Dutch wax prints. We're talking about Flisco, for example. But that a tapestry like this, that behind it, if you look at the material, the technologies that were used, and you look at how these change when different powers come into contact, when they impose their will for a particular diplomatic relation or creating particular industries, that it can totally transform also the way that people dress, the objects that people look at around themselves. Yeah, this is something that I wanted to make a note of. These here behind me, on my left and on my right, are, I'd say, the showcasings of two examples of how we can look at the history of the museum. So in the 16th century, you see that there's like the first depictions that we can find in images, prints, etc., of what's called like a natural history cabinet or cabinet of curiosities, which could be small, like an actual cabinet, or it could be an entire room of basically generally white men in Europe and then eventually also in white settler colonies, basically curating a space where they put different objects that they found interesting. And it's, I think, very telling to see that there's a huge mix both of, indeed, natural history. So you have plants, you have animals, you have all kinds of beings, you have landscapes, but you also have colonial subjects. So people that are enslaved, you have people that are doing forced labor, all of them studied, depicted as a curiosity, often in a way that also positions white people as, let's say, the most civilized, the most developed, and I think in an evolutionary perspective. Well, what you see in terms of the evolution of the museum is that you have these cabinets that then in the 18th century basically turn into museums. So it's like an enlarged form of these cabinets that were the private spaces of these white men, then turned into a space that's, let's say, more accessible to the civilized public. And then you see now, let's say from the 1970s, that museums start to think about themselves not just as cabinets of curiosity, but also as places of education. So you see now there's more emphasis, and from within the institution there's also more control of what happens from the perspective of people that work in the field, for example, of education. But at the end of the day, if you look at the people and the different beings, let's say, that are, I mean, I would say in a way, if you look at these objects, you know, encased, imprisoned, kind of stuck in time and space almost, in the way that they're shown, that, let's say, the subjects that were always put in the cabinet, that if they go into these spaces, if they go into the museum and they see what's happening, there might be some things that they find interesting for themselves, you know, in terms of thinking about their liberation and where they would want to go as a people in the future. But at the end of the day, museums continue really to struggle with why it is that they are educating people, what are they educating people about, and to really let go of being a cabinet of curiosities in which, let's say, people and objects that the, let's say, museum has power over, that these are put on display with, I think, a very difficult question of how can you put an object like this in display and then really allow it to be itself and to talk, to be free, to, you know, to also live the life of an object with agency and liberty, which I think, you know, you have with people as well as, yeah, for example, these shells, all objects, beings have a life. So this is the final stop of this virtual tour. There's two things that I want to say here. I first want to honor Ines also knows Perez Yongloy. You know, he's dearly missed, and he was really a fantastic activist. So I have this button that I showed you earlier on my jacket, which says 1873. He was the initiator of basically calling attention through these buttons, for example, to the fact that even though enslaved people in Suriname were, and beyond Suriname, of course, were enslaved up until officially 1863, that basically the compensation for this enslavement went to the enslavers, and that the enslaved were required to work another 10 years in order to make up for the loss and profits for the enslavers. So I just want to mention him and honor all the work that he did, as well as that I'm allowed to continue his legacy in some small way here. And I'm doing that here next to this portrait of Typhoon as Eliezer. Eliezer, I would encourage you to visit Oude Kerk aan de Amstel, where Eliezer's grave was found. And I want to talk a little bit about the ambiguity. So in this painting, or sorry, in this photograph, you see in the back some clothes on the bed. And then the question is kind of, this is Eliezer in the Netherlands. Is he an enslaved man, and are these the clothes of his master that he's prepared? Or are these his clothes, and is he not an enslaved man but a servant in the Netherlands or in Amsterdam? I think these kind of ambiguities, I don't think the point, I think yes, the truth is absolutely important. I think it's very important to do research into the truth. But I think at the end of the day, whether the person is enslaved, whether the person is a servant, I think also if we look today at the world, that the point is not to make a black and white distinction between enslavement and other kinds of subservience, but there's so many different kinds of oppression that exist, and that also the continuation of coloniality is not a case of you know, marking a date in a book that this is the end of slavery. We have to look at the ways that people continue to be oppressed and enslaved in different ways, even if it's officially not on paper. And I think it's part of this exhibition to recognize, you know, when we step outside the exhibition, what is Amsterdam? What kind of world is Amsterdam embedded in? What kind of people live in Amsterdam? How do they live here? You know, if we're talking about undocumented people, I think it's very important also for ourselves to look at an exhibition like this and be inspired to understand that we have to really look beyond what's written on paper, and to understand that the truth is much broader than that.